I will use my time to talk about specialization patterns and their potential, thank you very much, their potential relationship to economic development and economic growth. And in particular, I'm interested in functional specialization. By functional specialization, it's a bit of an abstract term, I mean the specialization along a firm's value chain. You may also label those functions tasks, if you prefer. Now, why do I think is this important? With the emergence of global value chains and the greater international division of labor, a new dimension of specialization came up, and this is this functional specialization. We have now very often the case that the value generation process of companies is geographically dispersed across different countries, and with that, countries can specialize in particular tasks or functions. And then there is this idea that along the value chain, the potential for generating value added is varying to a large degree. And if that is the case, we have a direct link between the functional specialization and economic growth and development. And the case I would like to make in the coming minutes is that the current functional specialization of the countries in our region is not the best, to say the least. Okay? And this comes with a risk in form of a particular kind of a development trap. This development trap I like to call the semi-periphery trap, and I will explain that in depth. It's a kind of a variant of the more well-known middle income trap. So this is an empirical fact that has also been mentioned by EBRD in this year's presentation of in the report and also at the presentation of the transition report. I think that what we see in Europe is really this semi-periphery trap, which has a strong functional element. So I try to explain this first of all in terms of incomes. Yeah? You see here a graph that is very similar to what has been presented by Jan. It's related to convergence. We have GDP per capita back in 1995 on the horizontal axis, and we have GDP per capita in 2016 on the vertical axis, in both cases relative to Germany. And in the graph, you see the positions of the countries, but you also see the 25% and 75% income lines of German income. This is somewhat arbitrarily chosen, but still it helps us getting oriented in the graph, because we can now give some interpretations to these individual segments. We start at the upper right-hand segment, and there you have countries that are core countries. They have already been rich, more than 75% of income of Germany, back in 1995, and they remained core countries. They remained rich. For our discussion, the most interesting segment is the middle one. This is where we find a big number of the Central Eastern and Southeastern European countries. But what you will also notice is that the cell above is empty. This cell is empty, but ideally it is not empty. Because if a country is converging strongly towards the core countries, it would show up in this upper middle segment. So what this graph tells us is that even after about 30 years of transition now, none of the countries in our region has managed to surpass or to reach 75% of German income. And we can make a small comparison. If we move down a bit the development ladder, we see much more dynamics from countries that I label here periphery, if they are below 25% of German income, to move up in this middle segment of the graph. So there's more movement going on here, which is compatible with this idea that there is a threshold that countries have difficulties to overcome. Like the middle-income countries run out of steam in their convergence process once they come close to the high-income level. Now, in Europe, it's, I think, not appropriate to speak of a middle-income trap because, first of all, we have already some countries like Czech Republic or Slovenia that are already high-income countries. But as I've mentioned before, I think there's a particular element that creates this trap here that you may or may not agree that we can detect here in the data, and that is this functional component. So let me explain a bit more what I mean by the semi-periphery. Well, first of all, there's a good thing, because semi-periphery implies that that I'm not talking about peripheral countries. And one characteristic of the semi-periphery is that the countries are well connected to the international economy, and especially into the European production networks, and that is definitely the case in our region. You have seen this probably before. This is a simple graph showing that the industry structures of the Central and Eastern European EU member states has become very, very similar to that of the EU 15. This is exemplified here with the medium to high technology exports as a share of total manufacturing exports. And this industry group comprises important products like, or important industries like the automotive industries, machinery, other transport equipment. And this has been, of course, a big success story, right? This is this big success that has been made in upgrading and in internationalization in general. So that's the nice part of the story. But now I come to this point of functional specialization. Huh? And there, I think there are some problems if we believe in this. This is the smile curve, which has been initially introduced by former Acer CEO Stan Shi. And he put forward the claim that for most manufacturing firms, the potential for creating value added is actually not the greatest in the core function production itself. In contrast, typically more value is generated at the pre-production stages, like R&D activities, headquarter functions, and also at the other end of the value chain in the services activities, marketing, after-sales services, these kind of things. And this gives this smile curve here that you see here in the graph. And now our attempt, and this is this part of this research project that Jule has mentioned that we are currently conducting, we try to use this functional breakdown and come up with some empirical data for countries. And I will come to that in a minute. Let me just stress once more that we should be careful with terminology here and to make sure that when I speak of production, I don't mean manufacturing. In fact, all the data I will show you, all the numbers I will show you, relate to manufacturing firms. But manufacturing firms, to come up with a product, they don't only have to produce, there's a lot of other stuff to do. And these are these other functions that you can see here. Okay, so we should keep those two terms apart. Now, at this stage, some of you may expect the example of the famous iPad, where it has been shown by researchers that China, although it is exporting this whole gadget, only earns a couple of dollars out in terms of value generation in the whole product. I will show you an even simpler picture, just a shoe. And also people made efforts to divide the costs and the value generation here. And even with a very generous calculation, you would find that only about 15% really goes to the actual manufacturers. Everything else is captured by the lead firms, retail functions, which have higher shares in the value generation, which gives support to this smile curve economics idea, right? And there is a lot of case studies that come to similar conclusions, even though at this stage, of course, this smile curve economics is not a really waterproof theory. So it's not, there is a lot of case study evidence on this. Now, so here's the new evidence that we present here for the first time. You will maybe recall the functions along the value chain on the horizontal axis. And what we show here for individual countries, here's the case of Czech Republic, is what kind of foreign direct investment projects, or more precisely greenfield investment projects, those countries attract. So it's a frequency measure that that these bars measure. The higher the bar, the more the country, well, let's be more concrete, take the bar for production. This would show you that Czech Republic attracts relatively more FDI projects from direct investors that serve the function production than any other things, like R&D or support services. And we call this relative functional specialization, those patterns, because the numbers you see here are index numbers because we take them relative to the average country in the world. So we have a global sample, and all the data, these frequencies are relative to the world. But the main thing to see here is that Czech Republic's functional specialization is obviously geared towards production. So it's activities on the factory floor. And just to make sure you don't believe that Czech Republic is a particular case, here comes Poland, which has a pretty similar profile. Also functionally specialized in production. We can go to Serbia, where the profile is even more pronounced because the very knowledge-intensive pre-production functions, especially R&D, are even lower. And here's another interesting case. This shows Slovakia next to Germany. Both of these countries form part of the what we call the Central European Manufacturing Core, this group of countries that has been very successful in the manufacturing sector. And I've just shown you that the countries within Europe in an industry dimension have become very similar. But here, if we look at the functions, we see the complementarities between the Central Eastern European countries and the EU core countries. We have mentioned that before, but here for the first time we can actually underpin this claim with empirical data. You can see Germany, although it's a manufacturing powerhouse, it's not really strongly specialized in production. It's strong in R&D, it's strong in some of the services activities, it's strong in headquarters. So that's where their comparative advantages seems to lie. And if smile curve economics are correct, of course, the type of functional specialization you would like to have is that of Germany. We can put that also in a broader global comparison. And there, the idea is not to read all of these country labels. Just look out for the yellow colored bars, because these are the bars of the countries in our region. And you will easily notice that basically all of these countries are relatively far up. They are all, they all qualify as what we may call here factory economies, to use a term that Richard Baldwin also likes to use for countries that are highly specialized in this value chain function production. The numbers you see here are related to the things you've seen before only, it has been simplified in the sense that it doesn't show you 5 or more functions along the value chain. It has been kind of collapsed to show or give the ratio between production activities on the one hand and all the other activities, the pre and the post production elements. We can zoom in a bit here into this upper part of the graph to the factory economies. And there I would like to highlight China, which is still described as the workshop of the world. Has a relatively high production specialization index here, but we can also look at the comparable numbers for the most advanced Central Eastern European EU member states, the Visegrad countries, and you will see that their production specialization is even higher. So if it's true that China is the workshop of the world, these countries should be called the workshop of the EU. You may say now that, okay, all I'm showing with this functional specialization is income, or the development stage of countries. And to some extent this is true, because we can see this in this graph. This is, on the horizontal axis, the GDP per capita, and on the vertical axis, the relative specialization in production. And what the solid line shows you is that initially, as countries grow richer, so if you move right, the countries specialize more in the value chain function production, typically because they get linked into the global economy, receive some FDI, and specialize according to comparative advantages. But then comes a turning point, and the specialization in production declines. And we can zoom into highlight countries, the Visegrad countries again, and what you see here is that their specialization in production is far above what you should expect at this income level. So the point I want to make here is it's not really only a story about income. On contrast, it's high time actually, given the income level for the most advanced CE member states, to adjust their functional specialization. Let me just only show you this graph to also highlight another element of this semi-periphery, which is the fact that global players, domestically grown global players, are missing. And we illustrate this here with the example of the outward FDI to inward FDI ratio. 0 would denote a country that has equality between inward FDI and outward FDI. If it's a negative number, the country is receiving more inward FDI, which is as such not a bad thing. But at some stage, countries as they develop should also develop their own multinationals if they are supposed to also capture some of the economic rents, some of abnormally high profits. But this is not the case in most of the countries in our region, which you can see with the highly negative values here. And to me, this graph also shows an economic hierarchy, because to have multinational activities means also that there are firms that have so-called ownership advantages, to use a term from Dunning's development theory. I will conclude to wrap up. Most of the Central Eastern and Southeastern European countries have been well integrated into European value chains. It's a big success story, as has been said before, but, and that's why I think there is a development trap looming, it has an inadequate functional specialization as factory economy, which means they have low value added creation, and so they will stay, they will remain in the status of a semi-periphery, with the effect that the convergence process to the core countries will be aborted too early, and that this existing economic hierarchy that I believe exists should be expected to remain. There would also be some policy suggestions how to improve the situations, but since we also have a policy panel, and there are probably people who are much, much more capable of talking about this, and also for the sake of time, I will spare you this, only to mention my conviction is that the market alone, the market forces alone, will not do the job, so policy action is needed, and I'm looking forward to the panel for some guidelines on this, and of course also for any questions. Thank you very much for your attention.